Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War. I'm live in London at the Imperial War Museum on the 19th of October. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/London for more information.
I went to visit her in Holloway prison, and that was weird, really. It was just her and me in a room. It wasn't like you see in all the telly, crime things now, tables in a canteen and lots of people. It was just her and me in a room. And the conversation was weird in lots of ways.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. In the sleepy suburb of Ruislip in London during the late 1950s, life was anything but exciting for Gay Search, a 15-year-old girl. Little did she know her mundane existence was about to be shattered by a shocking revelation that would turn her world upside down. In this gripping tale of suburban espionage, the story begins with the seemingly ordinary Kroger family, Helen and Peter, who lived just a stone's throw away from Gay's house. Helen was a vivacious, boisterous woman. Peter, on the other hand, was quiet and bookish, running an antiquarian book business. However, beneath the friendly facade lay a dark secret. The Krogers were in fact Soviet spies, part of the infamous Portland spy ring. I'm delighted to welcome Gay Search to our Cold War conversation.
There was me, my brother, 2 years older than me, my mother and my father. My dad worked for Lucas Gas Turbines, so he was in the aircraft industry, and his job was liaising with the various engine companies that we had in those days, de Havilland and Hawker and Siddeley, Armstrong Siddeley and so on. So he was away a lot, driving all around the country. Mum was at home. My brother was 2 years older than me, both at the same school. And when it all began in the November of 1960, he was 17, I was 15.
What was life like in Ruislip for a 15-year-old girl in the late 1950s?
In 2 words, extremely dull. It was a suburb and everything that went with that. So, nothing exciting ever happened as far as I could see. And so when all this began, it was sort of quite extraordinary and in many ways quite unbelievable that something like this could be kicking off in boring old Ruislip.
Absolutely. So on the next street from you lived Helen and Peter Kroger in a bungalow. What were the Krogers like?
The geography was incredibly important. Our house, the side of our house, and the bottom of our garden ended in a footpath. And facing onto the side of our house was the Kroger's bungalow. So the geography was incredibly important because the place they were vulnerable from was our house. We were the only house with a direct view of the front of theirs. So they'd arrived in the early 50s and were, particularly Helen, were extraordinary. I mean, she was loud and boisterous and always wore trousers and always rushing around. My dad used to call her Dizzy Lizzie. She was always in and out of our house, never staying very long, not borrowing a cup of sugar exactly, but that sort of thing, or just popping in for a few minutes almost every day. Peter was completely different, very quiet, bookish. When they first arrived, he had an antiquarian book business in the Strand, one of those half shops. I don't know if you remember those. Sometimes shops were divided into 2 to make 2 very small shops, and he had one of those. But after a not very long year or so, he moved his business to the bungalow because his business was antiquarian books that were posted out all over Europe.
I've seen one of your other interviews where you described Helen as quite exotic for Ruislip.
Well, that's what I was saying. Ruislip was such a boring place. And although we had Americans in the street because of the huge American Air Force Base in South Ruislip, we had American families. Helen was of a different kettle of fish altogether. I mean, she was very outgoing. I sort of joke about calling her loud because I don't know whether they'll come on to this, but years later they made a documentary film with the Krogers back in Moscow, and they took my interview back to Moscow and showed them and got them to react to it. And Helen says, "I don't know why Gay says I was loud. I was never loud." It's brilliant. So she was very, very, she was good fun. I mean, to a teenage girl, she was absolutely wonderful. She clearly had been young, unlike my mother, who'd been born middle-aged. And, she was just a breath of fresh air. And she was terrific. I mean, we didn't see very much of Peter. And my mother, who was very interested in art and literature and stuff, would have loved to talk to him more. But once he started working from home, everybody kind of kept a very safe distance. Oh, Peter's working from home, we can't disturb them. But Helen was always on her rounds, popping into us, popping into the house opposite ours, popping into the house next door, just for a couple of minutes usually. But she was always around.
Yeah, and she sort of saved you in an incident with a motorbike ride as well.
She kept my dark secret. Yes, she saw me on the back of a motorbike that I was strictly forbidden to be on. And she told me a few days later that she'd seen me, and although she wasn't going to rat me out to my mother, she didn't think motorbikes were a very good idea. So I perhaps shouldn't do it again. So, yeah. But she was that kind of adult. I mean, she's the kind of adult every teenager, particularly in a very dull, repressed kind of suburb like Ruislip, needs in their life.
Yeah, I can imagine. What did Helen chat about with your mum when she used to pop over?
Oh, everything and nothing, really. I mean, she didn't stay long. She'd just chat about stuff, really. I mean, I wasn't around when she was in and out usually because I was at school. But Mum said she was just popping in. Oh, God, I'm so tired. I've got so much to do, and I've got to go here and I've got to go there. And, always just sort of general daily chit-chat, nothing deep, nothing heavy. I don't know whether she ever asked about anybody else in the street. I don't think so. It's not something I remember or remember hearing about, but she may well have done. She may well have done.
You don't know whether politics ever came up in conversations or anything like that?
No, my parents, both working class, poor, grew up very poor and working class in southeast London, to my constant amazement, were both long-life Tory voters. Go figure. So, no, I mean, they didn't talk about politics, really.
Helen was into photography as well.
Yes, that became a bit of a joke. She always talked about her great hobby, her photography, and she had a very expensive camera. I don't know what it was. It may have been, somebody said it might have been a Leica, but they'd had their bathroom done out with boards that they could turn into a darkroom, so Helen could develop her own pictures. And on Fridays, my mum would have lunch with the same group of women friends in Ruislip after she'd done the weekend shopping. And then they would come back to our house, and in the winter they'd be indoors, but in the summer they'd be out in the garden. And Helen would hear the voices and would step on the ledge on the outside of our garden wall, which was dipped in the middle, and peer over and see the girls, as she called them, and say, "Oh, great, I've just got a few snaps to finish up on my camera," and would come round and take a few pictures with her camera. But the joke was we never saw them. And the odd occasion we did, they were terrible. Half people, half cut off and all of that. So it became a bit of a joke, Helen's hobby.
Yeah, but I think what you said earlier is she was obviously aware that the big vulnerability of where they were in terms of surveillance would have been from your house. Absolutely.
And that's why it was so important to her to have that kind of relationship with my mother, that she could pop in almost every day, even just for a few minutes, and chat, so that, if anything came up, if anybody came round asking questions, she thought my mother would say, "Oh, that's odd, somebody was asking about you the other day." And of course, that's not what happened when people did start asking questions.
So, November the 4th, 1959, life gets a little bit more exciting when there's a call from your local policeman.
Yeah, our local policeman, PC Puddicombe, lived at the top of Courtfield Gardens with his 3 girls, who were sort of friends. And he knocked on the door during the day and said to Mum he'd had a message to ask her to ring Superintendent Smith at Scotland Yard. And of course, in those days, people were so much more biddable, so much less questioning than they would have been later. And so Mum did as she was told, got through to Superintendent Smith of Special Branch, as it turned out. And he asked if we would all be in that evening because 2 of his colleagues would like to come down and talk to us. So that was sort of interesting and intriguing. Anyway, these 2 men arrived. One, I'm sure, was ex-RAF. He looked the type. He had a sort of, not a handlebar moustache, but a sort of mini handlebar moustache, and was wearing a tweed suit. And the other one was sort of saturnine with thinning dark hair. And they showed us a photograph, which turned out to be of Gordon Lonsdale, but no names attached. They were interested in this man. They knew he was regularly in the area. Had we ever seen him? And we all looked at the photograph, and very disappointing to have to say no, we'd never seen him.
Gordon Lonsdale was in fact Colin Molody, a Soviet intelligence agent posing as a Canadian businessman. He was a non-official KGB intelligence agent, aka an illegal, and the leader of the Portland spy ring.
So then one of them said, well, in that case, we really need to place 2 officers in the house over the weekend because we know he's here. We've checked in his usual parking place, which was at the other end of the short footpath at the bottom of our garden, opposite where it, and the Krogers were the first bungalow you came to after the footpath. We know he's here because his car's parked there. So we need to put 2 people in the house. So 2 same men came back. Saturday, nothing. Sunday, Mum was downstairs in the kitchen. They were upstairs in my bedroom, which the window of my little box room bedroom overlooked the front of the Krogers bungalow. And in those days, of course, we didn't have central heating, and it was November and it was freezing up there. So Mum took them up some coffee. And then about half an hour later, one of the chaps came down with the coffee cups, and our kitchen sink looked over our garden and also looked over our quite low garden wall at the front of the Krogers bungalow. And Mum was at the sink, and he came and stood behind her and put the cups down on the draining board. So they were both looking out of the window when suddenly the front door of the Kroger bungalow opened, and the man in the photograph came hurrying out, quick look over his shoulder up Cranley Drive, and disappeared into the footpath. So my mother obviously told my father, but did not tell my brother or me. And that night, Jim Scarden, who ran the operation for MI5, telephoned my parents and said, in the light of what had happened, they really needed to station agents in our house on a daily basis. And they would send women, because obviously strange men appearing at the front door of number 1 Courtfield on a regular basis would certainly have got the tongues wagging, knowing my dad was away at work.
Yeah.
And Mum said, she told me afterwards, she said, obviously knowing who they were watching now, but Helen's in and out of the house all the time. And basically the answer she got was tough. You just have to live with it, cope. So that's what happened. 2 women would come every day. The geography of the area, again, terribly important. At the top of our little cul-de-sac, Courtfield Gardens, was another footpath. So the agents would come through that footpath, down Courtfield Gardens, into our front door. And because we had a huge yew tree in the front garden, there's just a small gap through which you could see the Krogers bungalow, they weren't seen from there. So they were there every day. Sometimes one of them would follow Peter up to town if he went up to town. with a package of books. But mostly they just sat in the house. And very quickly, Mum said to them, look, it's freezing cold upstairs. Why don't you come sit in the kitchen? It's where the boiler is, it's warm, and the side window looks out over the wall, so you've got the same view of the Kroger. You won't miss anything. And so that's what they did. They weren't meant to, but that's what they did. And one day, a few weeks in, one of the women, Joyce, an ex-Women's Royal Army Corps recruit, was obviously chatting to Mum and had missed Helen leaving the bungalow. And the first they realised she was on her way, or potentially on her way, was when they heard the back gate go. We had a side gate, and Helen used to come through the side gate and just walk straight in through the kitchen door. And so Joyce made a dive out of the kitchen into the downstairs bathroom. Our only bathroom was downstairs. And as Helen walked through the back door, Mum noticed her handbag on the floor by the chair she'd been sitting in. And, I mean, talk about think on your feet. She said, oh, that flipping daughter of mine, she'll be the death of me. She never puts anything away. Picked up the bag and slung it into our cupboard in the kitchen. So, yeah, that was a bit unpleasant. And Mum found it very difficult having to face Helen almost daily, pretend nothing was wrong, just chat and laugh and, you know, act as though nothing was happening, act as though there weren't two women in the bathroom or possibly upstairs watching them. My brother and I noticed she was getting, as we thought, even more snappy and difficult than usual. And that's what mothers do. And we talked about it between ourselves because we'd been told that they were sort of police but not really police. So in our limited way, we thought it must either be drugs or spying. And we both fell about laughing because the notion of either in boring old Ruislip was just so absurd. So that we know it, and then we just carried on with life. And I remember very vividly one day my brother was a mischievous lad, and after the agents had gone, he started to do a sort of mock Russian dance around the kitchen. And my mother went absolutely bonkers. We both thought, And then after about a month, maybe longer, it was reported back to Scarden and whoever else that Mum was finding it all a terrible strain. And so Mum and Dad were invited to lunch at the Bull in Gerrards Cross, which was a very smart roadhouse in those days. It's now a Burney Inn or the equivalent, but it was a very smart restaurant, the Bull at Gerrards Cross, with Jim Scarden and a man who was not introduced. But years later, when there was all that kerfuffle about was Roger Hollis the fifth man, and there were photographs of him in the paper, my dad said that was the other man who was at the lunch.
So the Director General of MI5, wow.
Yeah, and they said to Mum and Dad that they had very, very strong evidence that the Krogers were Russian agents and that this operation was incredibly important. And although they realised it was really, really hard for Mum, they really had to insist that it carried on. And I think Mum or Dad said to them, well, if you've got all this evidence, why don't you arrest them now? And the answer to that was that the geography of the bungalow, which was end of a cul-de-sac with only a narrow footpath. There was a huge sports field behind, so not overlooked at the back. One neighbour to the side, not overlooking the front, and only us. And they thought that it might well be a transmitting station for other cells. And they just wanted to hang on as long as they could to see whether they could catch anyone else. It was business as usual. And then Christmas came. They didn't come Christmas Day, Boxing Day, and they were back in early January. And then on the 4th or 5th of January, I can't remember, which was Saturday anyway, they weren't there. They didn't come at weekends. But Mum got a phone call from, I think, Jim Scarden to say they thought the Krogers were getting edgy and they were going to pick up Houghton and G and Lonsdale outside the Old Vic when Houghton and G arrived from Portland with the documents in a shopping bag and handed them over.
Houghton and G were the other members of the Portland spy ring.
And then they would drive down to Ruislip at about the time Lonsdale would be expected to arrive, and they would then pick up the Krogers. So, in fact, that wasn't strictly true. I don't know how much you know about the background, but the man who'd recruited Harry Houghton in Warsaw, Michael Golonewski, was Polish security, but he was also a mole for the KGB. And earlier in that year, he'd also become a mole for the Americans and for our secret services. His American code name was Sniper. His British code name was Lavinia, which is just, I think it's totally funny. Anyway, the fact was that Golonewski was getting very nervous. He was obviously leading a very, very dangerous life. And he said to them, "You've got to get me out today." And the Americans obviously shared this information.
The story of Golonewski is featured in our episode 178. There'll be a link in the episode information.
And they knew that the moment the Russians realised Golonewski had gone, they would close down every operation he'd had a finger in, ever. So that was why they had to move on that day. So about, I suppose, 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Mum got another phone call to say that they had picked up Houghton G and Lonsdale outside the Old Vic, and they were on their way down to Ruislip. Superintendent Smith was coming because MI5 had no powers of arrest, so Smith was coming to arrest them. And I was in the sitting room, Mum was in the kitchen, and since handbag gate, our back side gate was kept permanently locked, damaged in a storm, apparently. So Helen always had to ring the front doorbell. She couldn't just walk in. Everybody else too. So I'm in the sitting room, the front doorbell goes, I answer the door, it's Helen. I say, "Oh, hi, Helen, Mum's in the kitchen." Just a usual kind of visit. So the first thing Mum knew was when Helen walked in through the kitchen door, knowing that within half an hour they were going to be arrested. And Helen was moaning. She would moan quite a lot about how tired they were and how ill and how long the winter was and how they thought they might try and go away and get some sun. And Mum's thinking, probably not. Anyway, Helen left and Special Branch arrived, knocked on the door. The Krogers opened it, invited them in. They arrested them. Helen said if they were likely to be away for some time, would it be all right if she just stoked the boiler? And they said, certainly, but just leave your handbag behind as you go. And in the handbag was a letter from Lonsdale in Russian to his wife, one-time code pads. There was all sorts of incriminating stuff in the handbag. Anyway, we knew nothing of this. And then about 10:30 that night, my brother came in and said, "What's going on over the road? Front doors open, all the lights are on, people are walking in and out." And my parents kind of played dumb, no idea, don't know what's happening. And then the next morning, Phil and I were in our little downstairs dining room revising. We had mocks at the beginning of the spring term, his A-levels, me GCEs as they were then. There was a knock on the door and Jim's garden walked in. And he leant up against the sideboard and we just carried on really, just, "Oh, hello," not particularly bothered. He said, "You'll be pleased to know you won't be seeing us after today." Fine. Yeah, we arrested Mr. and Mrs. Kroger last night. What? You did what? Oh, yeah.
And did he say it was for espionage or explain why?
No, they just said they'd, and I mean, we knew by then we worked out that it was espionage. It clearly wasn't drugs. Wow. And I was a very dramatic child. I went upstairs, I gathered together everything she'd ever given me. She'd always given me little presents, bits of costume jewellery and scarves and bits of nail varnish and, that sort of thing. And I threw it all in the dustbin. And what I don't understand, even to this day, is why I simply accepted that that was the truth. It never occurred to me to say, "You've made a terrible mistake, this can't be right." And I don't know why. I have absolutely no evidence to support my view. I just believed it. And they said to us that the arrests would be announced that afternoon and to expect a flood of journalists on the doorstep, which indeed happened. Lots of knocking on the door. "What about your neighbours? What can you tell us?" Acted surprised, totally just not knowing anything, couldn't believe it, couldn't help. Had we got any photographs of them? And of course we hadn't, because although Helen was forever snapping the girls and the family to use up rolls of film, she was never photographed by any of us. So we had no photographs. And then it all kind of it speeded up very quickly.
Can I just hold you there, Gay? I just want to ask a couple of questions before we get on to sort of like the trial and that side of things. As a 15-year-old, it must have been really difficult to not tell your friends about this while it's going on.
Absolutely, you're right. And I'm very, very, very impressed and surprised by 15-year-old me that I didn't. The closest I ever came was very early on. They put an extension telephone in my bedroom because that's where the watchers were meant to be. They weren't meant to be in the kitchen where the main phone was. And people didn't have extensions in those days. I mean, we'd only just got our own phone line. We had a party line with a neighbour for some years before we got our own dedicated phone line. So I rang my best friend at school, Sarah Horgan, one evening, and I said, "You'll never guess where I'm phoning you from." And then I kind of chickened out and she didn't pursue it. And that was it. That was as close as I ever came. But I'm very impressed that I didn't tell anybody.
Yeah, so am I. And I understand that Helen was trying to learn to drive and your dad was helping out by taking her out for drives too.
Yeah, well, Helen had a driving licence. I'm not sure which country, because it's all very weird because the identities they took, Peter and Helen Kroger were actually New Zealanders who were killed in a car crash. But the Krogers presented as Canadian from day one. I mean, they were always Canadian, insisted on it. But Helen had a foreign licence, but she had to get a British licence after so many months. And my dad had a company car. It was a black Ford Consul with leather seats. And when they bought a car, they bought a black Ford Consul with red leather seats. So from a distance, nobody could be completely sure who was in and who wasn't in, interestingly. And anyway, she was learning to drive. And one Friday, I think it was, my dad came unexpectedly early home from work and Helen was in the street. And he said, "Oh, do you want to go for a drive, get a bit of practice in?" And she said, "Yeah, sure, great." So Ruislip's on the A40, as you know. So they drove down to the Northolt Airport, Polish Royal, turned right onto the A40 and drove to Oxford and drove back. So they were gone about 2.5 hours. And when they drew up outside the house, Peter emerged from the bungalow, absolutely incandescent with rage, which was something that none of us had ever seen. He was the mildest, quietest spoken, gentle man, and he was absolutely incandescent. And of course, with hindsight, he obviously thought she'd been picked up. And because she didn't have time to go in and leave a note, Dad said, "Well, come on, let's go," and off they went. And another time, because he used to send books all over Europe, and we subsequently know why. It was a very good way of getting microdots out of the country. And he sent books all over Europe. So he was always going to the post office and having to do forms and filling in stuff. And one day he was very laid back. It's only Ruislip Manor post office, not far. And Helen came over to Mum, sort of anxious, and said, "I don't know what's happened to Peter. He's been gone ages." Mum said, "Oh, I'm sure he's fine." She said, No, this isn't normal. He's not normally gone this long. And Mum said, "Well, if you're worried, why don't you ring the police? Maybe he's had an accident." She didn't ring the police, obviously. Peter came back. He'd had a particularly difficult set of paperwork to fill in and stuff. But yeah, so they lived. I mean, I realised later that they lived the most awful life. I mean, they were on tenterhooks the whole time. They just never knew, when it was all going to kick off. Because they'd been there before. They got out when the Rosenbergs were arrested because they were working with Rudolf Abel in New York.
We also have an episode on Rudolf Abel. It's episode 273. That will also be in the episode information.
And when the Rosenbergs were picked up, the FBI went for the Cohens, as their real name was, only to find them gone. Everything there, all their clothes there, paper, everything there, and food still warm on the table. So they'd literally got out by the skin of their teeth that time. So,
yeah. They were charged under the name of the Krogers because the British didn't really know who they had, but eventually they sent the fingerprints over to the US, and the US confirmed that they did indeed have a couple who American intelligence had been after for quite some time.
Yeah, that's right. And that came out in the trial. It was the first time that Gordon Lonsdale was named as Colon Molody, who was a colonel in the KGB, and Peter and Helen Kroger were named as Morris and Lona Cohen. And they were all found guilty. I think Houghton and G went into the witness box. The Krogers did not go into the witness box, nor did Lonsdale, but he made a statement saying that it was all him, that he duped his friends, the Krogers. They had no idea what was going on, da-di-da-di-da. But the evidence that was presented in court that they'd found in a very extensive 3 or 4 day search through the bungalow included several radio transmitters, code pads, all sorts of paraphernalia at Spy. And so the jury very quickly found them all guilty. And Houghton and G got 15 years, which, anyway, the Krogers got 20 and Lonsdale got 25, which I sort of thought was a bit the wrong way around, really, because Houghton and G were the traitors who'd done this for money, whereas the Krogers and Lonsdale were professionals. They were illegals, but they were professionals, ideological spies, if you like. But anyway, that was the story. During the trial, the Krogers barrister was quizzing one of the MI5 men. It was apparently the first time any MI5 operatives had been cross-examined in court. And this defence barrister was trying to claim that he couldn't have seen what he claimed to have seen because there was a huge thick hedge between him and the Krogers' bungalow. And in fact, the huge thick hedge was at the bottom of our garden between our house and a block of flats. And they were obviously assuming that that's where they'd been watching from. And Mr. I, as he was in court, said to the judge, "Your Honour, may I draw you a little map?" And he drew him a little map and it was handed to the judge. And the judge said, "I see, almost directly opposite number 45. And there's only one house that was, and that was us. And Mum had been told all the way through that she would not be called to give evidence. But at the end of that day, the defence asked for Mrs. Ruislip to be called. MI5 went nuts, quashed it. Mum didn't have to appear in court. But if Peter and Helen were in any doubt at that stage as to where they'd been observed from, then that was the absolute clincher. So they knew.
So did it stay out of the press, or did the press eventually work out that, your house had been key to the case?
Well, funnily enough, I suppose it's rather remiss of them. They didn't come knocking after that. No, they didn't. They didn't. I suppose the story was so kind of juicy and exotic that on its own, Spies in Ruislip, come on, that they didn't think it was worth pursuing. But anyway, they didn't. And then time went by. Mum never really got over it. It took an enormous toll on her because it just undermined her faith in people. The character that Helen presented of herself, this ditzy, dizzy whirlwind who liked a bit of naughty literature, Peyton Place, that sort of very mild sort of naughty literature which she would lend to Mum. Mum would hide in her tall boy, thinking I wouldn't know where it was. Wrong. So, and if she could turn out to be in the KGB, then how could you trust anybody? How could you trust that anybody was what they appeared to be? And I think that was really, really hard for her. And because my dad was away a lot, she'd had nobody she could talk to. She couldn't tell other neighbours. She couldn't talk to anybody. So it really, really took a toll on her. And I think it was a factor in the heart attack she died from. Not long after
it must have been enormous stress for her having to deal with Helen on a daily basis.
Yeah, pretend nothing was wrong. And, Mum not having any training anything like that, and just not used to being that duplicitous, I suppose.
Yeah,
anyway,
I guess her being able to chat with the female surveillance officers during the day must have at least been an outlet in terms of company.
Yeah, I think that was important. And one of them, Joyce, she of the handbag, and her partner, also ex-Women's Royal Army Corps, moved to Ruislip after it was all over, and Mum saw them for a while, and then I think one of them died or they moved away or something. But yeah, she did have that, but she couldn't tell us. She couldn't, as I say, my dad wasn't there to talk to. And many years later, after my friend Hugh Whitemore wrote the play about it, Pack of Lies, my dad said to me, I thought at the time the best way to help her cope during and after was just not to talk about it. And I realise now how wrong that was. But by that time, Mum was dead, so, But that was his fairly British way, I think. Let's pretend it didn't happen. Let's pretend nothing's going on. Let's just pretend everything's normal and it'll all be fine. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's sad. You mentioned Pack of Lies. Were you involved in any input into the, Ring of Spies or Act of Betrayal / Pack of Lies?
Yes, absolutely. What happened was, after some years, when I was working as a journalist, I thought I would like to go and visit Helen. I would be very curious to go and visit her in Holloway. And there were already rumours starting about a possible swap. I think Lonsdale had been swapped then for Greville Wynn. And there was talk about the Krogers, but it was only, very distant.
Greville Wynn was a British businessman who was recruited by MI6 to act as a courier for Oleg Penkovsky, a key Soviet agent. The story of Greville Wynn has been portrayed in the movie The Courier, starring Benedict Cumberbatch. We have an episode about Penkovsky. It's episode 175. There'll be a link in the episode information.
So anyway, I wrote to the Home Office, wrote a very naive letter, childlike handwriting. I would like to visit my Auntie Helen. And got a letter back saying, we've told her of your request. If she wants to see you, you will get a visiting order. However, we know you are a journalist and you are not allowed to report on anything you may. Fine, thank you very much. Anyway, I did get a visiting order and I went to visit her in Holloway. And that was weird, really. It was just her and me in a room. It wasn't like you see in all telly, crime things now, tables in a canteen and lots of people. It was just her and me in a room. And the conversation was weird in lots of ways. She asked what I was doing. I told her. She asked about my brother. She asked about my father. Then there was a silence. Then she asked about my aunt, who was one of the Friday girls. Then she asked about the other Friday girl. Fine, so we carried on chatting, and she said she was looking forward to going home. And I said, where's home? And she said, Poland, duh. But of course, Poland wasn't home. The United States was home, but there was no way they were going back to the United States, where they would have been met off the plane by the FBI. Thank you very much. So she said that, yes, she was Lona Cohen. She wasn't Helen Kroger, but they hadn't been spying. And we carried on sort of just idly chatting. And I said, if you are going back, is there anything you'd like me to send in for you to take? And she said, yes, Mitcham cream. And it was a cream, I don't think you can get it now, but it was to get rid of the age spots on the back of your hands. It was a little touch of the old vanity. And as I was leaving, literally, it was a sort of Columbo moment almost. As I was leaving, she said, I'll never forgive your mother for what she did. And I said, oh, come on. What possible choice did she have? And she said she should have told me. So that was the last I saw of Helen. I sent the Mitcham cream in, and then a few weeks later, they were indeed swapped for Gerald Brooke. Seeing all this swapping going on now, the American journalists and people clearly just taken by the Kremlin as bargaining chips. This young guy had been selling Bibles or delivering Bibles in Moscow and was arrested by the Russians as a pawn. He was swapped for the Krogers. They flew back to East Germany, I believe. but fairly soon afterwards were flown to Moscow, where they lived until the end. And then a few weeks after all this had happened, I was having dinner with some very old friends, a man called Cedric Messina, who produced Play of the Month for the BBC, very well-established drama producer. And the subject came up, and I said, well, of course, you know my involvement. And they all went, no. And it's one of those stories that you assume you've bored everybody you know with inside out, but I'd never told them. So I told them the story. And next morning, he rang Hugh Whitemore, who I had met a couple of times at Cedric, and said to him, boy, have I got a story for you. So I then spent a couple of days with Hugh talking through what had happened. And that turned into Act of Betrayal, which was filmed in Ruislip, not in Cranley Drive, but Mum knew that it was happening. And she was very pleased that it was happening because she'd never had any acknowledgement for what she'd done. The women that she fed and watered all those weeks, because, they weren't meant to, she wasn't meant to, but, what's she going to do? Let them sit there and not eat. So she cooked for them and all that. They bought her a set of fish knives and forks. But officially, she didn't even get a letter of thanks. Nothing. So the fact that the story would be told was very pleasing to her. And within a couple of weeks of the filming being finished in Ruislip, the studio hadn't been done and it wasn't ready to transmit, she sat down in the chair in the kitchen, the famous chair, and had a massive heart attack and just died. So Act of Betrayal happened after Mum had died. And it was very well received. I became very good friends with Hugh, and we used to talk a lot because he was freelance, I was freelance. And you don't have colleagues when you're freelance, so we'd ring each other up and just chat for 2 minutes, in the way you'd pop your head round somebody's office door if you were in an office. And he said to me one day, there's so much more in that play, there's so much more in that situation, I really want to have another go at it for the stage. And so that's when he wrote Pack of Lies. And Judi Dench and Michael Williams did it in London, and it was done in Paris, it was done in New York, it was done all over the place. And it was just interesting. And it's slightly tricky when you see something that's a semi-factual but not factual version of events I mean, Hugh said, I'm not writing a drama documentary, I'm writing a drama. And the character he created, Barbara Jackson, was not my mum. It was more Hugh's own mother, actually. But he wanted the freedom to put that character in those situations and circumstances and see how they'd react. So that's what he did.
Yeah, that's a hell of a tribute. I know it wasn't actually playing your mother, but Judi Dench playing that role. And as you say, your mum's crucial role in the rolling up of the spy ring had finally been recognised. Yeah, it was great. And Michael Williams played my dad. It's one of the rare stage plays they did together. And then about 4 years ago, they revived it at the Menier Chocolate Factory at London Bridge with Finty Williams, Judy and Michael's daughter, playing the part that her mum had created. And we went to the press night and Judy was there, and she's pretty well blind now. But I sat with her and we had a little chat, and she said when Finty got the role, she rang her up and said, Ma, I really must talk to you about it. Tell me all. And Judy said, darling, it was 40 years ago. I don't remember anything about it. And she said, but the moment I sat down in the theatre and it started, it just all came flooding back to me. She said, that was interesting. I think you also got a letter from Peter.
I did. I wrote to Peter when it was announced that they were being swapped. And I'd been asked by a colleague at the BBC to see whether they might be interested in doing an interview once they were back in safe territory. So I wrote to him with that partially in mind, at least. And I got a very long kind of folksy letter back from him saying that they needed to go and sit by their own fire and reflect and, all of that, and that time had not been kind to Helen and that women take prison much harder than men, all that sort of stuff. But I've still got the letter. And I interviewed another guy who'd been in Parkhurst with Peter, completely different circumstances, context. And he said that what was interesting about Peter, because they had their own little kitchenette in Parkhurst and they had a toaster, and Peter would always deliberately burn his toast. He would never eat toast that wasn't burnt. Whether he thought, I don't know, somebody, but yeah, they all noticed that and thought it was a bit odd.
Yeah.
Anyway, back they went to Russia, and then a few years later, a documentary company approached me. It was a co-production between a Russian company and a British documentary company. And the plan was to interview me and another woman who'd known them through the book trade in London, take those interviews back to Moscow, show them to Peter and Helen, and get them to comment. And as I said earlier, Helen's very funny. She's still very croaky voiced and didn't look that much different, older, but very recognisable, and reacting to me saying she was loud and boisterous.
Here's Lona responding to Gay's comments.
We used to go to visit the family because we knew that she was lonesome. She didn't have very many friends, and they were very economical. So many times I used to bring a little present over from my heart, because everybody on the street liked me. All the children used to come, and I used to have candy in the car, and I'd give them a piece of candy to all the children. They all loved me. But why Gay says I was loud and boisterous, I was never loud and boisterous. I was gay, but I never was boisterous. But she recalls me in this sense because everybody there was so meek. I was protecting them. I felt that I was protecting them, that there shouldn't be another war, because so many of my friends suffered during the war. Either they lost their fathers, their sisters, or children. And I used to think I was protecting them, because if both sides were equal, America and the Soviet Union, there'll never be another war. So I was really protecting them. I never felt that I was an enemy of them. I figured I was protecting them, and they were not conscious of it. I couldn't tell them that I was protecting them, but that's what I was doing. That's the way I felt.
I was never loud. I was never boisterous. I was gay, because everybody in those days, they were just so meek. It's a very funny interview. And then Peter talks about the day they were arrested and how, we were very naive living in suburban Ruislip in the 50s, but he's got such a strong Brooklyn accent that how anybody could have thought for a second he was Canadian.
There was a police van which was camouflaged like the post office van in front of our house, and we felt very peculiar. So we thought, since Ben was coming on Saturday, we would raise the question with Ben. We felt it would be wrong for us to run away. We felt we must discuss this with Ben and see what will happen Saturday.
His version of events is that on the day they were actually arrested, there'd been a police van disguised as a post office van parked outside their house for 2 days. The first weekend MI5 moved into us, they went up the telegraph pole by our front gate, put a tap on their phone. The idea that they would park a van right outside there is just ludicrous. Just ludicrous.
When MI5 first turned up, they borrowed your bike, didn't they, to check if Molody was parked?
Yeah, they wanted to go and check that his car was parked there. And he borrowed my bike, and I thought that was very funny because my bike was a terrible old bone shaker and I'd got no lights on it. And I thought it would be very funny if the guy got picked up for riding without lights. But he didn't.
Absolutely.
But yeah,
absolutely.
That's how we knew.
I think one of the things that amuses me with this case is obviously that the bungalow changed hands a number of times, but even as late as the 1980s, the owners were still finding bits of spy paraphernalia that MI5 hadn't found.
Yeah, they found, it's when they started doing building works and knocking things down and knocking down. They found one buried under the terrace. They found another one in the garden. But it went on over years, these things would turn up. And it was obviously very well set up. And the photography was all about photographing the documents that Houghton and G brought up on a Friday night or Saturday morning from Portland, and then turning them into microdots, which were then put into the books that Peter was sending all over Europe. So that's what all the camera equipment and the darkroom was about.
Did your mother reflect, after the Krogers had been arrested, on her relationship with them?
Yes, she did. I mean, she didn't talk about it much, but she did talk to me, not to my brother or my dad. And she said that she rarely went to sleep without crying, thinking of them separated, because for the first, I think, 4 or 5 years of their sentence, they weren't allowed to visit each other. And they'd given up everything for the life they'd chosen. They had no family. They had no contact with their birth families. They had no they had no one apart from each other. And she just thought that was really, really cruel. But it did, as I said earlier, it did undermine her faith in people. That if Dizzy Lizzie, with all her, zany, scatty behaviour, was actually in the KGB, how could you trust anybody?
I can see that completely sort of undermining your judgment of people.
I mean, it was just funny afterwards hearing the local people talking about them, and the dustman saying things like, "Oh, we always loved her. She was always inviting us in for a lager in the kitchen." I mean, no, they didn't invite anybody in, hardly ever. I mean, obvious reason. And we knew something was funny was going on because the television signal was all jangled,
I've heard that story. Is that just a made-up story, that whole television interference thing?
One of the reasons why I think it all compounded on Ruislip was because a mile and a half down the road was RAF Northolt and what had been Northolt Aerodrome. When I was very small and my dad was flying off on business, it was from Northolt. Heathrow didn't really exist then. So you had that with the loads of radio traffic. And then you had the US Air Force Base at South Ruislip, huge sort of bureaucratic, it wasn't an airport, but it was a huge bureaucratic setup with a commissary and a PX and all that stuff for all the American servicemen in the area. And there was a lot of radio chatter there. And just occasionally they pick up short bursts of other radio chatter that they couldn't identify. And that must have been coming from the Krogers because they transmitted as well. And I didn't go over there much. I remember once my parents were going out and they'd asked Peter and Helen if I could go. They didn't trust me on my own, can't think why. If I could go over and just sit in their living room and do my homework. And I did. And they had a huge radiogram, beautiful radiogram. And on the end of it, on a hook, were a pair of headphones with an extremely long cable. I mean, it must have been 12 or 15 feet of cable, which I looked at and thought, that's I haven't seen one of those. I mean, obviously, didn't make anything of it, but I did notice it. So they did transmit as well. But I think the microdots were the main way that stuff got out, because Peter had clients all over Europe, all over the East, all over the... Yeah.
I saw some of their equipment in an exhibition at the Science Museum, and it showed one of their transmitters, and it also had the burst transmitter as well, which sent a lot of information in like seconds, as you said, burst transmissions.
Apparently what happened after New York was that they were somehow spirited out of the States to Mexico and then taken by ship or submarine, who knows, to Moscow, where they were trained for the next 2 or 3 years in spycraft because they'd been amateurs in New York. And apparently, I don't know whether it's true, but the story is that it was Helen who went down to Los Alamos with her shopping basket and got the entire set of plans from Theodore Hall and brought them back on the train to Colonel Abel in New York. Because Peter was away fighting then for the US Army in Europe, ironically.
I interviewed an East German who was trained as a KGB illegal in Moscow, and part of his training was with Peter and Lona.
Oh.
It was really interesting because he said Peter was just a complete chatterbox. He was talking about all sorts of stuff, and I think the bulk of his training was with Peter, really training in American language and idioms and all of that sort of side of things. The episode with the KGB illegal is episode 140 and 141. There'll be a link in the episode information.
Well, I mean, they were nothing if not thorough, the KGB. Apparently, Conan Molody, Gordon Lonsdale, when he was about 8 or 9, was sent to live with an aunt in California, and he lived there till he was 18. So his American English was absolutely flawless. Sure. And the giveaway, the real Gordon Lonsdale, was circumcised apparently, and Conan wasn't. So yeah, but his son, Trophil Molody, believes that his father was murdered. Because when he went back to Moscow, he took to drinking heavily and bad-mouthing his superiors. And he was mushroom picking one day in a wood and had a heart attack. But Trophil thinks he was murdered by the KGB to shut him up.
I've seen a photo of Molody and Abel together in Moscow.
Really?
Yeah, which is interesting. I've covered Abel quite a lot. I managed to interview somebody who was a friend of his in New York, in this sort of artist colony that he was hidden in, and that was really interesting, just getting some insight as to what he was really like, and what it was like actually speaking with him. And similarly, speaking with you, it's been fantastic speaking to somebody who did their homework in the middle of a spy ring in Ruislip, of all places.
I know. It's weird. I mean, I don't know, I'm sure you know that Rudolph Abel isn't even his real name.
No, Willie Fisher from Newcastle upon Tyne.
I know.
Brilliant.
It's just so weird, yeah. But when they were filming this documentary with me, the director was Russian, spoke no English. But through an interpreter, he told me that when the Coens had gone back to Moscow, they were offered the full works, the nice flat, the access to the foreign shop, all of that, Hero of the Republic status. And they said, no, that's not what we're about. That's not what we've done all this for. And they died very old and ill in the KGB nursing home. Helen died about 3 years before Peter, I think. I can't imagine how miserable his last few years must have been.
Well, also, he saw the demise of the Soviet Union as well.
Yeah. And that, when they were interviewed for this documentary, that was already happening. And there were lots of questions they wouldn't answer. But it was clear that to see an ideology and a cause that you had given literally your life for, given up everything for, just crumble, must have been so hard. So hard.
The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.